So welcome, thank you for coming to the Peace Research Colloquium that we have to hold virtually. Unfortunately, we would have loved to host you, Professor Jana Krause, in Basel, but hopefully there'll be another chance in the future. This is hosted by Swiss Peace and by the Graduate School of Social Sciences at the University of Basel, and great to see a good mix of students and researchers and practitioners here with us. I will briefly introduce our speaker and then hand over. So Professor Jana Krause has just been appointed Associate Professor in the Department of Political Science at the University of Oslo. She has taught and researched at various other institutions in the past, the University of Amsterdam, the War Studies Department at King's College London. She has also had visiting fellowships at Yale University, and she has completed her PhD at the IHED, the Graduate Institute of International and Development Studies in Geneva, and has also worked at the German Institute for Global and Area Studies in the past. I hope I've covered them all. So we really have a really wealth of great institutions and experiences there. And from all of these places, I gather this research emerged that was published and that we will hear about. Was published in 2018 with Cambridge University Press. The book is called Resilient Communities, Nonviolence and Civilian Agency in Communal War. So Professor Krause will give us a book talk. So we're very curious, many of us here, about the research. It has won the Lee Ann Fuji Award for Innovation in the Interpretive Study of Political Violence by the Interpretive Methodologies and Methods Conference Group of the American Political Science Association. And it was a runner-up for the 2019 Conflict Research Society Book of the Year Award. So we are really very happy that you're here to present the book today. So without further ado, the floor is yours, Jana Krause.
Thank you so much for the warm welcome, and thank you everybody for taking time to listen in to my book talk today. It's really a pleasure to present the book virtually on Zoom in your colloquium today. It would have been nice, of course, to visit in person, but I'm glad we can have a nice discussion in this forum. So let me share my screen with you so that you can see the presentation to make it a little easier to follow the talk. There we go. Okay. And okay. So let me start today with the motivation that led to the development of this book over many years of research and at quite a number of academic institutions, in fact. Just to give you a bit of context, so I started in Indonesia, where about 20 years ago, the authoritarian regime, military regime under General Suharto, came to an end and the country transitioned to civilian and democratic rule. And observing this at the time, it was fascinating to see the power of a nonviolent protest movement succeeding against the Suharto regime. The transition and the democratization process were supported by prominent, charismatic, and also moderate Muslim intellectuals. Now, for context, Indonesia is the world's most populous Muslim majority country. And at a time when discussions about religious conflicts and a clash of civilization were prominent, Indonesia's religious leaders were praised for supporting pluralism and democracy. Indonesia did have Muslim extremist parties, and they were vocal during the transition, but at the time, politically remained at the margins. During the wake of the transition, however, in the town of Ambon, which is the capital of Maluku province in eastern Indonesia, you see the town here on the picture, a communal conflict broke out that was quickly understood as a religious war and was in fact one of Indonesia's deadliest conflicts during the transition period. Maluku is just a small province in eastern Indonesia, made up of numerous little islands. At the beginning of this conflict in the year 1999, it was gang fights that broke out in this town center, which was nothing unusual. But this time, they quickly escalated into communal violence between the local Muslim and Christian population. Maluku province is one of Indonesia's few regions with a sizable Christian population, where Muslims and Christians each constituted about half of the local population. And it was only within weeks that the entire town and the surrounding villages were affected by communal violence. And even though the national government deployed additional military troops to curb the fighting, the conflict escalated so dramatically that the main church and the main mosque in Ambon turned into local war headquarters that collected information regarding battles taking place and coordinated relief efforts. Local militia groups formed who recruited through the church and the mosque networks, and these militias originated from the town, but they soon carried their battles also in the most remote villages, attacking Christian and Muslim settlements and forcing a campaign of ethnic cleansing. One of the features of this communal war was the recruitment of child soldiers into these militia groups. Both sides recruited children at the age of 10 and above for special child fighter units, who were often first sent into battles even before adults joined. And the picture shows you a recent documentary by the BBC into the lives of former child soldiers of Maluku, where they discuss how they were received as little heroes within their religious communities back then. The conflict in Maluku only ended more than 2 years later, after grassroots groups, and among them prominently women groups, initiated dialogue and understanding along the religious divide. Eventually, Indonesia's then vice president brokered a peace agreement that ended the war, but strong tensions and a heavy military presence remained for more than a decade there. And the first question that I ask in this book is, how do communal conflicts escalate into local wars? This question is important because communal conflicts kill thousands in conflict-affected states. And by communal conflict, I mean non-state armed conflict, fought between two or more social groups. Unlike in civil war, where the national government and its military would be one official party to the conflict. As you can see here from the fatality estimates for the Maluku conflict, the violence escalated so dramatically that within a year of fighting, almost 1,500 people were killed. At that time, the province had a population of only about 1.5 million people, so the death toll was enormous. At the height of the conflict, 1/3 of the entire population of the province was displaced. You can also see further in this figure that, at least for the first 2 years of the war, deaths within the town and within rural areas were almost on par. And previous studies of communal violence, such as Washni's or Wilkinson's earlier work, understood communal violence primarily as an urban phenomenon, particularly linked to elections. However, my analysis shows that communal violence has a significant rural dimension, and in fact, urban and communal dynamics also often interlink. So I study communal conflicts because many of them result in significant political instability. They're fought by armed civilians, which has dire consequences for other forms of political violence, such as election violence, but also civil war and armed crime. They often precede or proceed civil wars and ethnic cleansing. Think about cases such as South Sudan or Mali currently, where communal conflicts escalated so dramatically in the shadow of insurgencies and UN peacekeeping. And UN peacekeepers are also now increasingly mandated to address communal conflicts and protect people from such killings, but it is unclear how peacekeepers can engage armed civilians. And lastly, the legacies of these major communal conflicts also impact all forms of political violence in a country. So the militarization of local communities, the guns that people assemble, they are rarely recollected and thus remain available even when communal violence dies down. But Indonesia is not the only country where communal conflicts have caused massive violence and victim numbers on the scale of a small civil war. Nigeria, of course, is another African country that for decades has been plagued by deadly communal violence. I also conducted research in the city of Jos in central Nigeria, which you see here in the picture. And this is a place among those worst affected by intercommunal violence along overlapping ethnic and religious divides. And this conflict has killed in the central Nigerian region, probably an estimated more than 12,000 people over the past decade. The first time I traveled to Jos was back in 2010. It's about a 5-hour drive from the capital in Abuja, mostly through the countryside. And I remember it well because on the highway, my driver and I always had to pass several military checkpoints. Back in 2010, more than 1,000 people had been killed in Jos and in the nearby villages by communal violence, also along the Christian-Muslim cleavage. And since then, the killings had in fact spilled out of control in the countryside. So the soldiers tried to prevent the smuggling of arms into this conflict region. Once we entered Jos, the city looked like a war zone. There was a heavy military presence at all major junctions and near previous areas of fighting. And along some of the main streets, I could see the long lines of burned houses that showed just how intense the fighting was. Now, the modus operandi of the Nigerian government and many other governments in this context has always been a heavy military deployment to suppress the movement of gangs and militias. And such deployment can temporarily stop killings in the city, but in rural areas where most of the recent fighting over the last few years has taken place, security forces do not have the capacity to bring these killings under control. And in recent years, you may have heard or read that so-called farmer-herder conflicts have escalated so dramatically that they have been deadlier than the Boko Haram insurgency. Now, similarly to the conflict in Maluku, Indonesia, these victim estimates that I show you here for Jos and rural areas of Plateau state demonstrate the level of escalation of the conflict. In fact, when fighting first broke out in the year 2001, more than 1,000 people were killed in only 5 days. And even when the killings in urban areas subsided, they continued in rural areas and in small towns. And so when a conflict that involves the state government, a civil war, kills 1,000 people per year, political scientists usually define it as a civil war. This is a threshold. And therefore, I define communal conflicts as communal wars when they reach that threshold of 1,000 victim numbers per year. My analysis also shows how dynamics of urban and rural violence interlink and reinforce each other. And this is because many people who live in cities have social networks to their home villages in rural areas. There are linkages with regard to family, ethnic, religious community, but also business and trade. So if a massacre takes place in Jos, victimizing one religious community, the atrocities reverberate across rural communities as well, and they further polarize relations. With that increasing polarization and the given structural factors, such as conflicts over land and the consequences of climate change, rural conflicts can quickly escalate. So in my book, I develop a typology of communal conflicts, which is really fundamental for explaining why some conflicts escalate to the level of communal wars and how they can be addressed. And I distinguish these conflicts along several dimensions. The first is a type, one-sided versus dyadic conflicts, but then also geography, armed actors, national context, and finally the repertoires of lethal or non-lethal violence. And I find it helpful to think in this typology to study the variation of violence in different types of communal conflicts, because it has many implications for ending such conflicts, preventing them, but also for protecting civilians in these contexts. Because how civilians can protect themselves in the context of pogroms or dyadic clashes, for example, has important implications for prevention strategies. But however, not all communities located within conflict zones experience devastating violence. And civil war research has shown that violence, in fact, varies on the ground geographically. And the same holds true for communal conflicts. So my book's second research question asks, how do vulnerable communities located within conflict zones prevent killings? And what do I mean with vulnerable communities? Vulnerability obviously depends on the context of specific conflict dynamics. In the context of communal conflict, I mean communities located in close proximity to worst affected conflict areas. So given the dynamics of ethnic and religious conflicts, I also mean communities that were demographically mixed, so similarly to those that were affected by killings. These communities also include a socioeconomic mix of poor areas and better off middle class areas, but they also included a sizable number of unemployed men who were at risk of being drawn into the fighting. And lastly, for the context of communal war and militia formation, I also mean communities exposed and within reach to external armed groups. And I can briefly tell you that standard explanations for why some communities may not be affected by communal violence do not hold for the cases in my book. So, for example, none of the vulnerable communities that prevented killings enjoyed adequate or timely protection by security forces. These communities also suffered from political tensions, polarizations, in many ways similar to those that were devastated by killings. And this means that there's no straightforward alternative explanation to why these communities were not devastated by fighting, in contrast to the one that I will present to you in a moment. So what are the theoretical arguments and contributions of the book? First, as I just argued, I define large-scale communal conflicts as communal war. I think they're better understood in this terminology than using, for example, the term riot, which can mean very different things. And secondly, I explain how communal violence emerges from below. Now, this argument stands in contrast to much of the communal violence literature, which is usually elite-focused and explains such conflicts with top-down approaches. My first research question asked how communal conflicts escalate to communal wars. And I answer this question by focusing on the dynamics of political mobilization of actors such as gangs, vigilantes, thugs, into political networks that become polarized around ethnic and religious identities, but then also the process of social polarization and traumatization of communities, which is important to understand how people change their perceptions and why it becomes increasingly difficult to stop escalation dynamics. And lastly, the formation of militia groups is crucial for this escalation process. Their recruitment, their professionalization, their mobilization is a turning point, because at this stage it becomes increasingly impossible for security forces to prevent fighting and to stop the killing by sheer force. My third argument focuses on the emergence of non-violence from below. And here I draw on the socioeconomic resilience literature and its key concept of adaptation. So my analysis shows how non-violent communities adapted to changing conflict dynamics. And in resilience research, adaptation is linked to generic social dynamics, such as social knowledge, social learning, anticipation, scenario building, and community organization. And these dynamics are not only relevant in the study of climate change, but they also very much apply to the context of armed conflict. I also draw on the literature of rescue behavior during genocide. The community leaders of resilient communities whom I interviewed, they were individuals with significant social knowledge about conflict dynamics because they had previously lived in conflict zones and they had experience in dealing with armed groups. So apart from their knowledge, they also displayed high-risk leaderships. In fact, they at several times risked their lives to prevent killings. They were so-called first movers who built confidence and trust in their communities, which resulted in a mobilization for non-violence and prevention. So in sum, I argue that it is vulnerable communities that became resilient communities. And understanding how they became resilient has important implications for the study of peace building. Now, in the rest of this presentation, I will briefly talk about my research design and then focus on the empirics of the Nigerian case. So how did I arrive at these findings? I first rely on a cross-case comparison to study how communal conflicts escalate to communal wars. And the cases of Ambon in Indonesia and Jos in Nigeria fit this purpose well because both regions did not previously experience significant communal violence, and the escalation process was not influenced by conflict legacies. The answer to my second research question of how vulnerable communities prevented killings, here I rely on a within-case comparison between a set of two similarly mixed and neighboring communities in both Ambon and in Jos. My research is primarily built on fieldwork material, more specifically the interviews that I conducted within a period of 6 years in total and several trips to Indonesia and Nigeria. And these were interviews conducted with community leaders, religious leaders, but also men who had joined the fighting and simply ordinary residents in several communities. And during my fieldwork, I found that two types of respondents were best able to explain the dynamics of violence. First, the perpetrators, those who had fought and killed, and who could explain the rationality of fighting. And second, leaders of nonviolent communities who explained how they prevented these killings. Let me briefly also say that I follow in my interview analysis an interpretive approach to understanding civilian agency. And I rely, so I'm interested in perceptions of people living through the conflict, how people make meaning of the situation and how they understand their options, their behavior options of how they can respond to the situation. I assume theoretically a behavioral spectrum where people under different sets of circumstances can potentially be perpetrators, but also rescuers. They can be ignorant, they can try to protect themselves, or they can try to protect others. So I don't follow a rationalist approach, but rather acknowledge that individuals might be driven by altruistic motives or very much by their own desire to protect themselves and to simply survive. In the rest of this presentation, I will talk about the organization of communal violence in Jos, and then I focus on one paired comparison of one violent and one non-violent community in the city. The Jos conflict is rooted in local elite competition over who qualifies as indigenous. And this is a question that relates to the legacies of colonial rule in Jos. It's a question about which population groups originate from Jos and which groups are settlers. It goes back to colonial times and arbitrary empowerment of local ethnic groups. But indigenous rights are so important in Nigeria because they practically regulate access to middle-class lifestyle. Indigenous rights determine access to political appointments, positions in government offices, higher education, and also land rights. And conflicts over indigenous rights are very common in most parts of Nigeria. And despite decades of debates about this problem in Nigeria, the central government has been unable to reform indigenous rights, in part due to the chronic political instability and the insurgencies in the north and south. But in Jos and in other regions of central Nigeria, conflicts over indigenous rights link to overlapping ethnic and religious cleavages. And this means that political mobilization around elections or land rights strongly reinforce existing ethno-religious boundaries. As I said earlier, communal violence usually does not spread evenly throughout a conflict area. In Jos, it was a city center, which you see here on the map, the big circle, that was worst affected during all three major episodes of communal violence between 2001 and 2010. In addition, the south of the city also experienced much violence once the killings had started in the center. And then there are several neighborhoods in the city center where people killed or expelled their ethno-religious minorities during the very first day or two of the fighting back in 2001. And when there was no one else to attack within their own neighborhood, these armed groups marched through the city to attack other neighborhoods or to face opposition groups in battles. The gang members I interviewed explained to me that for them it was common knowledge that once fighting had started, they had about 2 to 4 hours to move through the city to different areas before police and soldiers would deploy on the main streets. And even though security forces were often unprofessional and ineffective, their presence was a significant risk for armed groups because soldiers had shoot-on-sight orders. So the conflict in Jos escalated in part because armed groups became mobile. And they moved towards other neighborhoods to attack, to expel the minority population, and to loot. And they would often use smaller streets behind the highway and main street to avoid security forces, which means that they would march through a neighborhood dominated by their own group, and incite men to follow them into battle. In fact, both in Jos and in Ambon in Indonesia, many people told me that they did not fear their immediate neighbors taking up arms against them. What they feared was that a handful of neighbors from their own area would denounce them to the opposing external armed group and would facilitate an attack on them. Now, a paired comparison of the two neighborhoods in Jos concern the area of Anglo Jos and Dadin Kowa, which I have marked here on the map. Anglo Jos, both are ethnically, religiously mixed communities, socioeconomically mixed communities. The first one, Anglo Jos, bordered neighborhoods that were Christian dominated and who had expelled the Muslim neighbors during the very first days of fighting as well. And then they sought to continue fighting elsewhere against Muslims. So, for example, against Muslims in Anglo Jos. Dadin Kowa in the south was a large neighborhood with a number of poor settlements, but also middle-class compounds. And it was within easy reach of southern Christian armed groups located in the south of the city at the end of the map. And these were groups that had previously fought against Muslims in the neighboring area there and were involved in massive killings. But because the Christian men of Dadin Kowa refused to collaborate with any of the surrounding Christian armed groups, this group, in fact, marched beyond Dadin Kowa and eventually attacked the community of Anglo Jos in collaboration with Christians from the northern neighborhood. So Anglo Jos and Dadin Kowa were not just similar in terms of location within the city, but also in terms of ethnic and religious composition. They both had a sizable Muslim population, but Christians had a slight majority. And both areas were, in fact, under the same traditional leader, who had tried to prevent fighting in both areas. And yet, the outcome is quite different for the two neighborhoods. So the rest of the presentation focuses on why this outcome is so different. The picture here shows you the burned-out marketplace of the community of Anglo Jos. This area was religiously mixed. It was integrated into the central neighborhood, and where people from many areas would come to do their daily shopping because it was an important marketplace. Anglo Jos had a traditional leader, youth leaders, and religious leaders who had all proclaimed that they did not want to see any fighting in their community. And when clashes took place in 2001 and in 2008, community leaders succeeded in calming the tension and preventing any incidents. However, in 2010, during the last major clashes, these prevention efforts broke down, and the community was attacked by neighboring Christian groups. Now, according to my interviews, this attack took older community leaders by surprise. Since then, the burned marketplace that you see in the picture serves as a dividing line between the Christian and the Muslim part of the neighborhood. And many people have left the area because their houses were destroyed. In Anglo Jos, community leaders held ad hoc meetings to declare that they did not want fighting, but they did not further institutionalize such meetings and conflict management beyond immediate moments of crisis, despite the fact that tensions were always high in this area. And while youth leaders knew that youth and armed groups from neighboring areas would want to fight in Anglo Jos and pressured them, in fact, to facilitate attacks, it was the older community leaders who were not aware of this reality. So community leaders did not fully understand how, in fact, violence was organized in Jos, the dynamics between external armed groups and residents from one area facilitating an attack. They did not anticipate threat scenarios, and they were therefore unprepared when one attack finally took place. Now, in Dadin Kowa, you can see here in this picture a typical little street with the normal houses, a very large mixed neighborhood with a sizable population of unemployed youth whom people feared might incite to start killings. People from outside Dadin Kowa also confirmed that this neighborhood was never some kind of island of peace or harmony. Instead, as one of the gang members from the city center put it, every time there is crisis in Jos, Dadin Kowa is sitting on gunpowder. So what was different in Dadin Kowa was that residents and some leaders realized that without dedicated prevention efforts, their fate would eventually be the same as that of most mixed neighborhoods in the city. So these people did not perceive the conflict as a religious conflict, but instead they realized that they had to counter such polarization. It was particularly market women who acted decisively and came together to address rumors and conflicts and promote a common identity of people of Dadin Kowa. Because the women realized that with increasing tensions, people were no longer willing to buy their products from sellers from the other religious group. And so the market and their little income was at risk. And they did not want to end up like many of the IDP families who had lost their houses and their income. These women organized themselves, they met regularly, they lobbied male community leaders to take prevention efforts seriously and not only pay lip service to declarations of peace and harmony. But apart from these women groups, one community leader also stood out. He was a very respected man in the community. In the book, I call him Timothy. And when I interviewed him, he explained to me that he had previously lived through the Nigerian Civil War because he was from the east of the country, and he had experience in dealing with mobilizing men. So Timothy and other community leaders met regularly, and they ensured that the men whom they knew could easily start fighting in the neighborhood would be kept under control. I call this the consolidation of civilian social control. Community leaders did not allow youth groups to form, to take up arms, and to eventually come to control the neighborhood. Timothy and other leaders also engaged the leaders of neighboring armed groups in negotiations. And this is perhaps the most crucial aspect of their violence prevention efforts. In contrast to the leaders in Anglo Jos, Timothy and others anticipated threat scenarios, and they were well aware about which side might attack under what circumstances. So they negotiated with these armed groups, with community leaders in the other neighborhoods, and also with nearby security forces to credibly deter attacks. How could people from Dadin Kowa deter these attacks successfully? When armed groups moved to another neighborhood to attack, they had to rely on some collaboration from residents of the area to be attacked. Because in a religiously mixed neighborhood such as Dadin Kowa, an outsider would not simply know their way around and distinguish Muslim from Christian houses. Christian groups who wanted to attack needed information about the settlement patterns, the strengths of Muslim youth groups, and whether they had some arms, and also understand where security forces might be stationed and whether or not they might intervene quickly. And if they wanted to loot, they also needed to be allowed to attack and retreat through the back streets to avoid the security forces, potentially even have to rely on residents to hide them in their houses for several days until it would be safe for them to return to their places. So in other words, carrying out an attack in another neighborhood was risky, and nobody wanted to go out, fight, and then get killed. I have confidence in these findings because I also interviewed gang leaders and other perpetrators who equally explained to me that they could not just go out and fight wherever and whenever they wanted to. So community support and information was vital for them to be motivated to fight, but also to very much reduce the risk of getting killed. And with this, I come to the end of my talk to summarize the main conclusions. First, the book provides evidence for the argument that civilian agency is a causal factor for violence and for non-violence in communal conflicts. I second argue that resilient communities are no islands of peace, and that it is in fact very misleading to think or theorize about islands of peace, because everything that these resilient communities did was to mitigate conflicts, to address them, to solve tensions, to very much counter them, because they were embedded within some of the worst affected conflict regions. Third, I also think it's important to point out that even in these communities where violence prevention efforts eventually failed, prevention efforts did save lives. So even in the community of Anglo Jos that was eventually devastated by an attack, many people survived because at least they would get warning in time to be able to simply run and save their lives. And lastly, I think how communities adapt to conflict dynamics can inform prevention and protection strategies that are potentially transferable to other settings and other conflict regions. And this, of course, is the main takeaway also from the book, beyond these two cases of Ambon and Jos and these very particular communities. It is a question, what can we learn from these resilient communities and what can potentially be implemented in other conflict regions? Thank you very much for your attention. This is what the book looks like in terms of the cover, and I look forward to your questions.